Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Bashim Yahushai, Bashim Rakakwadash, double honors the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us the truth, and citations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to just go through this idea that has been, in my mind in regards to trimming the fat and sweet smelling sacrifices. And, I wanted to get this, how it actually entailed in the physical sense, and basically how, that sacrificial understanding of actually removing something, to become essentially more pleasing unto the Lord, us essentially being the sacrifice in this time, right? Because, Yahushua did away with those, his sacrifice. Ultimately, there was no more need, I'll say it like this, there was no more need for animal sacrifices, right? So, I wanted to just, go through this on this thought process. And Lord's will is always, this would be edifying, right? So I chose this particular sacrifice known as peace offering. So basically, a peace offering, was a particular style of sacrifice where, some of the fat and would be taken away, but also, it was a particular style of sacrifice which symbolized Thanksgiving. It also symbolized a portion of that sacrifice, was also given, to the priest, because, the priests, if you remember, when you go into like the book of Joshua, it was really the other tribes as opposed to the tribe of Levi that really got, a certain allotment of the land. The Levites didn't get their inheritance. Was basically to execute the priest's office, perform sacrificial duties and burn incense and, so on and so forth, right? So, they didn't have that, even though they had like cities they can sojourn in, they didn't have that, that physical, large portion of land mass where you can actually be able to grow vineyards and trees and so on and so forth, you know. So, I just wanted to read a little bit of this and kind of equate it, to basically ourselves, right? To see how it was during the time of the Levitical priesthood. And Lord's will, this would be an edifying lesson, right? So, this is Leviticus chapter 3. I'll start at verse 1 and read down. And it says, "And if his oblation be a sacrifice of peace offering, if he offer it of the herd, whether it be a male or a female, he shall offer it without blemish before the Lord." And it says, "And he shall lay upon his head, he shall lay his hand upon his head, of his offering, and kill it at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation." So this is where they were basically, sacrifices would actually be taking place, prior to, this is like, prior to the building of the Lord's house during the time of King Solomon, right? So here it says, "And Aaron and his priest shall sprinkle the blood upon the altar round about, and he shall offer of the sacrifice of the peace offering of an offering made by fire unto the Lord, and the fat," and it says, "the fat shall covereth the inwards, and all that fat that is upon the inwards, and the two kidneys, and the fat that is on them, which is by the flanks, and the caul above the liver, with the kidneys it shall he take away." So, so basically, there were certain portions of the sacrifice, when it comes to the fat upon the kidneys, that fat was basically taken away. It was trimmed, right? So I'll read verse 5, and it says, "And Aaron's sons shall burn it upon the altar for a burnt sacrifice, which is upon the wood that is on the fire. It is an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord, right? So that sweet savor is a theme that goes. It's a very essentially when you go into the sacrificial system, a good sacrifice would be basically would offer up. It would be like a sweet savor, right? It wasn't and then that's basically the objective, right? You didn't want to have a sacrifice that was basically a detestable sacrifice, right? So, with all that being said, even though we don't perform all these duties, right? With the animals and stuff like that, we are ultimately, the sacrifice, right? So, let's jump to um let's jump to Romans. This is Romans chapter 12, verse 1. And it says here, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of the Most High Yahweh, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto the Most High Yahweh Bashmel Shai, which is your reasonable service, right? So, this is just the way, we conduct ourselves, the way we actually our minds are renewed. This is a basically, the way we actually live, is a sacrifice, right? A sacrifice basically means to make something holy, right? Because what did Paul say? Paul said that you were Gentiles, carried away after dumb idols, right? As we were led, to roughly paraphrase. And so those ways, and then that's another thing too. Those ways, those idol, it was not just the fact that we were consumed by like idolatry and stuff like that, but all these different gods of these other nations where we were scattered, pursuant to Deuteronomy, the 28th chapter at the 64th verse. All these gods promote a sentiment of they all have a sentiment of worship, right? And you see it, in the way of the people's congregation. You know what I'm saying? They don't it shows in their behavior, I'll say it like that. So to please a lot of these different gods, right? Like for example, I remember there was a story in Kings where a king basically um I forgot who was reigning at the time, but there was a king of Moab, who, he basically sacrificed, his son to please that particular god. I believe it was Chemosh, if I'm not mistaken, you know. But the point is to please these different gods, of the other nations, which basically are no gods. They all demanded a certain kind of offering, a certain kind of sacrifice, and a lot of the time, well, majority of the times, I'll say it like that, it just promotes death, it promotes decay, and that's just one of the things that people don't understand. When you read in Jeremiah, like particularly the 7th chapter, a lot of our people, they were doing the same thing when it comes to that idol worship, because the Queen of Heaven worship was a thing that was very, very big, during Jeremiah's time, because what you had was a lot of Israelites, they were basically going and they were baking cakes, right? So you kind of like think about it in the physical sense, how today, how people celebrate their birthdays, there's a birthday cake and so on and so forth. You know what I'm saying? They were baking cakes, the children were basically gathering wood. As a matter of fact, I'll read it real quick and I'll come back to Romans. Jeremiah 7. This is Jeremiah chapter 7. Now, this is how they were provoking the Lord to anger through these different ways of idol worship, right? To pleasing these other gods, right? So, as opposed to doing what the Heavenly Father actually instructed us to actually do. This is Jeremiah 7 and 17. The point's in 18, and it says, "Seest not thou Seest thou not what they do in the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem? The children gather wood, and the father kindle the fire, and the women knead their dough, and baked cakes to make cakes, to the queen of heaven, and pour out drink offerings unto other gods, that they may provoke me to anger. So, right, so all these different gods, that's the point I wanted to make, demanded a certain level of offerings, you know what I'm saying? And a lot of these offerings and the things that they had to do, it displeased the Lord. The Lord didn't want us to be able to delete our children, offer our children by fire unto Molech and so on and so forth. This is where a lot of these people in the industry, they get these customs from, right? And Jeremiah said it, I think in the 10th chapter, don't learn the ways of the heathen, right? So it says here, do they not provoke me to anger, saith the Lord Yahweh? Do they not provoke themselves to confusion of their own faces, right? So this is why the Lord was so angry, because they were performing that sacrifice, but it was towards a particular God, right? So, ultimately, we put away those different ways, those customs, right? The Christmas and the Easter and all these different things that promote the sentiment of idol worship, birthdays and so on and so forth, because there was idol worship tied to those practices. And this is one of the things our people don't understand. They don't want to trim that fat. You know what I'm saying? They don't want to, our people are basically, they're not just fat, in the flesh, but they're fat really in the spirit, because they're holding on to excess. They're holding on to things that are basically making them they're slowing them down. They're living it, and what does that promote? When you're living fat and you're living good, it promotes a sentiment of comfort, ease, lethargy. You know what I'm saying? It promotes us like there's no urgency in what I'm saying, because if you're a disciplined person, you're the type of person that, okay, you have to, trim things, you have to get rid of things, and actually, to become more essentially useful, right? And that's really what this lesson is really, kind of going into, is basically trimming a lot of the ways, of this world, and even trimming a lot of like our own like bad habits to adopt certain like fruits of the spirit, that we may abound, like I think it says that in Peter's. I can always get that, after. And it's really just about, like constantly, trimming the fat so to become more pleasing, unto the Lord, right? Because, we've had, certain things that we were probably like addicted to, we were doing this and that, right? Let me go back to Romans. This is verse 2. And it says here, and be not conformed unto this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and that you may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of the Most High, right? To keep his commandments, because this is the whole duty of man, to roughly paraphrase. For I say, though the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly according to the Most High, Yahweh Bashem Shai, hath dealt to every man the measure of faith, right? So, and that's something that is very, very looked down upon in this world, because this world promotes things that the Lord hates. So, for example, like pride, they promote self-worship. They don't actually promote denying yourself. They don't actually promote this understanding of sacrifice. They don't promote, becoming more lean, basically, all those things that are, associated with, trimming, getting rid of things, actually trying to be more, profitable. Their profit, when it comes to being more profitable, they think about becoming more profitable within the flesh strongly, right? Restraint is another thing, because going to a lot of the ways of our forefathers, like one example, I'm thinking of, with it was a moment between, King Saul and David, King Saul, was tripping, and basically David had an opportunity, and I believe they were in a cave, if I'm not mistaken, and there was a dude that was like standing near to David, and he said like, "Yo, this is your chance, right? This is your your ability to get back, basically get your lick back." But King David was so spiritual that he didn't take it as an opportunity to um, get his own vengeance, because he understood that vengeance remains to unto the Lord, right? So he would basically he remained he exercised restraint, and that's another thing that this world doesn't really teach you, is really to actually you got to be like how Esau is, because Esau, if something is done to him, he would do it twice unto you. He doesn't exercise holding back or restraint or allowing a divine he doesn't have essentially a divine understanding where the Most High is going to recompense me. He doesn't understand that he's a carnal man, and the carnal man has that sort of enmity. What does it say, that a carnal mind has enmity with the Most High, to roughly paraphrase, right? It just brings forth death, right? So you see, and our people get seduced into that mindset, thinking that is a good will of the Most High, right? But you only destroy yourself. So, let me go back. Let me just go back to the point about sweet smelling. Um, one second. This is Ephesians 5, verse 1. And it says, "Be ye therefore followers of Yahweh Bashem Yahushai, as dear children, and walk in love as Hamashiach Yahushai also hath loved us." Right? You actually learn, what true love is, what I'm saying? And Yahushai actually simplified it, where, these two things, right? You love the Lord with all your heart and soul, and you love your brother, as yourself, to roughly paraphrase. These two things, ultimately encapsulate the law, right? To roughly paraphrase, but the point really is you actually learn exactly what true, love is. And a lot of our people, when you see it in their actions, they don't actually truly love the Lord, you know. I'll read verse 2 again, and it says, "And he walk in love as a Mashiach, Yahushai also hath loved us, and hath given himself for an offering and a sacrifice to the Most High Yahweh for a sweet smelling savor. But fornication and uncleanness and covetousness, let it not be one's name among you, that you become saints," right? So all these different things that are displeasing, these displeasing habits, these things are actually make you more abominable, right? So you want to be able to imitate, Yahweh Shai, and actually perform those, basically adopt those fruits of the Spirit. And if there's anything that Yahweh Shai, strongly exemplified, was the sentiment, of humility. That was one of the things that he strongly, exemplified, and also servitude, right? Because his mindset was like, "Yo, okay, you guys call me," speaking to the disciples, like, "Yo, you call me master and you call me Lord, but even though he's he's the example." That's really the point, when it comes to humility, right? Use it as an opportunity, like, make sure everybody calls me master, and so on and so forth, right? Because that is another also mindset of this world, because people think that a lot of the times they're in the position they are in because of their own merit. It's all by their own doing. There's no hidden hand that actually helps them. They don't actually, they don't see, when they see themselves in high positions, especially like the kings of the other nations and all this, and so on and so forth. They don't see it. They don't see them being in that position as them still being a steward over the people that they look after, because they think they don't have anybody to basically answer to, you know what I'm saying, in terms of like a power structure that is above them, right? This is verse 4, and it says, neither filthiness nor foolish talking or jesting, which is not convenient, but to rather give thanks. For this I know, no whoremonger or unclean person, nor covetous man who is an idolater, have any inheritance in the kingdom of Hamashiach and of the Most High Yahweh, right? So, all these things, we were, as Paul said, such were some of you. We were doing a lot of these things at some point, but, through constant, renewal and learning about Yahweh Shai, and it adopted basically a trimming of the fat, to get rid of those displeasing ways so we can become a lot more pleasing in the sight of the Lord, right? Like a woman that becomes more pleasing, for her husband, right? Like in Esther, it says how they, the women would basically, they would bathe in oils for, I believe it was like 6 months with myrrh and 6 months with frankincense, putting on certain perfumes and so on and so forth. Like, if I'm being honest, like as a man, as a young man, like, a woman that smells good, like, is a very pleasing sight to say, like, when you're around a woman and the woman not just looks adorned, but she smells really good, right? She's a delight to be around, right? So our adorning, is really ultimately like it's taking on these different characteristics, right? Our adorning, scriptures say that wisdom maketh a man's face to shine, right? So our adorning is becoming essentially more pleasing unto the Lord, right? So the Lord can actually cover us, protect us, right? So that's pretty much the point I wanted to hit, just adopting these fruits. I quoted this earlier, actually. 2 Peter. This is 2 Peter 1 verse 5, and it says, besides this, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience, and to patience godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness. And that's another thing I was thinking about yesterday in regards, to fruits of the Spirit as well. Like, the Lord will always put us in situations to exemplify a lot of these different, fruits of the Spirit, right? You'll find yourself in situations where you gotta, like, to exemplify this particular fruit. A fruit, when Yahushua talked about fruit, a tree is known by its fruits. That Greek word there is karpos, which refers to like a work or a deed, right? So acts, what I'm saying? So there's an action tied to actually playing this out, exemplifying this particular fruit, joy, charity, whatever it was, right? So, anyways, I'll leave the lesson there, but hopefully, this all ties together in terms of trimming, getting rid of, it's basically it's really all about getting rid of habits that's undesirable. Considering we are the sacrifice, we get rid of undesirable things about ourselves, right? So we can become more pleasing, right? So anyways, Lord's will, this was just quick and edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim El Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.